Neighbors laughed when he stacked glass bottles into his walls. They said the cold would shatter everything. In the winter of 1974, at -18 degrees, nothing broke. If you want to see how this house quietly outlasted winter, stay with the story. In the early 1970s, long before anyone laughed at the walls, the idea didn't begin with a house at all. It began with waste, piles of it. In 1974, in a quiet rural stretch far from any city centre, glass bottles were everywhere. Bars emptied crates behind their buildings. Small bottling plants stacked rejects in open yards. Broken cases were dragged outside and left in the weather, forgotten the moment the trucks drove away. No one thought twice about it. Glass was cheap. Replacements were easier than reuse. The man noticed them because he worked around them every day. He hauled scrap, cleaned back lots, helped tear down old storage sheds. In winter, he saw how certain things behaved when the cold settled in. Wood split. Thin metal sang and snapped as temperatures dropped. But the bottles, even after nights well below freezing, were different. Frost coated their outside surfaces, but inside, the air stayed still. Snow around stacked bottles melted faster than snow around bare ground. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to comment on, but enough for someone who paid attention. He didn't think in terms of innovation. He thought in terms of survival. Heating was expensive. Materials were harder to come by every year. Houses built thin and wide leaked warmth constantly, forcing people to fight winter instead of manage it. He had lived in places like that before, listening to wind move through walls as if they weren't really there. The first time the idea formed, it felt almost accidental. He was standing near a pile of empty bottles after a cold night, breaking ice off his gloves, when he noticed that his hands warmed faster when he held one. Not because glass was warm, but because it blocked the wind, because the air inside it didn't move. He turned the bottle over slowly, watching how frost clung to the outside, but never reached in. Later that winter, he paid closer attention. Bottles buried halfway in snow. Bottles stacked against walls. Bottles left untouched for weeks. They didn't crack the way people expected them to. The cold pressed against them, but without movement, it lost its force. The glass stayed intact, and the air stayed trapped. He began thinking about walls differently. Thick walls, walls that didn't breathe, walls that slowed cold instead of trying to stop it outright. Old cellars came to mind, stone houses he had seen years earlier that stayed cool in summer and tolerable in winter without much effort. They weren't comfortable because they were modern. They were comfortable because they were heavy and slow to change. Glass by itself wasn't the solution. He understood that. Windows lost heat quickly for a reason. But glass sealed inside thick walls, surrounded by mortar, shielded from wind. That was something else. Thousands of small pockets of still air locked in place, unable to circulate. Cold could touch the outside, but it couldn't rush in. When he mentioned the idea out loud for the first time, it wasn't a proposal. It was more like thinking out loud. He spoke about thick walls made from bottles, about using what was already being thrown away, about building small and tight instead of wide and thin. The reactions were immediate and predictable. People laughed. Some smiled politely, assuming he was joking. Others were more direct. Glass shattered. Everyone knew that. Glass was fragile. Everyone knew that too. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince anyone. At that point, there was nothing to defend. The idea wasn't finished. It was still forming, shaped by observation rather than ambition. But the laughter confirmed something important. If everyone else dismissed it so easily, it meant they weren't really thinking about the problem. By late spring of 1974, the idea had settled into something solid. Not a curiosity, not a stunt, a plan. Thick bottle-filled walls, sealed with flexible mortar, built low to the ground. Small windows, no wasted space. A house designed around how winter actually behaved, not how people wished it would. When he finally chose the site and marked the ground, bottles were already stacked nearby, waiting. To anyone passing by, it looked like a pile of trash next to an empty lot. To him, it looked like insulation. And with another winter always coming, that difference mattered more than anyone else realized yet. Once the idea stopped being theoretical, the work became slow and physical. There was nothing impressive about the beginning. No machines, no crews, just steady collecting, sorting and carrying. Bottles came from everywhere. Closed taverns, roadside bars that changed ownership and dumped inventory behind the building, a small bottling plant that discarded anything chipped or misprinted. He asked when he needed to. Most of the time, he didn't have to. People were glad to see the piles disappear. He didn't take them all at once. He learned quickly that size mattered. Thick glass held up better, uniform shapes stacked more cleanly. Long-neck bottles fit differently than short ones, and he separated them accordingly. Crates filled his shed and lined the edges of the site, thousands of bottles clinking softly as they were moved. What looked like chaos to anyone else became order under his hands. Before the first wall went up, he built the frame heavier than normal. The walls would be thick, far thicker than standard construction, and the structure had to support that weight without shifting. He kept the house low and compact, pressed closer to the ground than people were used to seeing. The foundation was simple but solid, wide enough to carry mass without cracking as temperatures changed. The bottles were laid horizontally, not standing upright. Each one rested fully in mortar, cradled so no single point took stress. The necks faced inward, toward the interior of the wall, while the rounded bases pointed outward. This wasn't for appearance, it was for strength. Rounded surfaces resisted pressure better, and if cold ever tried to push its way through, it would meet curve after curve, never a straight line. The mortar mattered as much as the glass. He mixed lime with sand and soil, avoiding modern cement that cured too hard and cracked when temperatures swung too quickly. Lime stayed slightly flexible. It breathed just enough to absorb movement without failing. As the walls rose, the mortar wrapped each bottle completely, sealing air inside and locking it in place. No drafts, no channels, just thickness. The work moved in sections, a few feet at a time, never rushed. Each layer had to settle before the next was added. In daylight, the walls caught light strangely, the ends of bottles glowing faintly under plaster. From certain angles, they looked fragile, almost decorative. Up close, they were anything but. The walls were heavy, solid, and cold to the touch even in summer. People stopped to watch as the shape of the house became clear. They commented freely now, no longer whispering. Some joked that he was building a greenhouse. Others said one good freeze would shatter everything. A few were convinced the walls would sweat constantly and rot from the inside. He listened without reacting, continuing to work, smoothing mortar, setting bottles, checking alignment by feel more than sight. Windows were cut small and placed carefully, higher than usual on the walls. He wanted light, not exposure. The fewer breaks in the bottle walls, the better. Inside, the space began to feel enclosed quickly. The thickness of the walls was impossible to ignore. Sound changed. Wind noise from outside faded even before the roof went on. The house felt sealed, as if it had already decided where the outside ended. As the last courses of bottle walls were completed, he sealed them fully with plaster, leaving only faint impressions of the glass beneath. From a distance, the house looked plain again, almost normal. Up close, it was still unsettling to people who weren't used to it. Too solid, too strange, too different from what they trusted. By the time the roof framing began, the walls were finished and cured. Thousands of bottles sat locked inside, each one holding a pocket of still air that would never move. The structure stood quiet and unmoving, waiting. Winter was still months away, but the house was already built for it. The house drew attention long before it was finished. In a place where most people minded their own business, this one made that impossible. Even from the road, Something about it felt wrong to those who passed by. The walls were too thick, the windows too small. In certain light, faint, circular patterns showed through the plaster, hinting at what was hidden inside. People didn't need to be told what it was made of. The rumor traveled faster than any explanation ever could. At first the comments were casual, almost friendly. People stopped while he worked and asked questions they didn't really want answered. They laughed as they spoke, smiling the way people do when they assume the conversation is a joke. Someone said it looked like a novelty bar. Another said it reminded them of a roadside attraction. A few suggested he'd regret it once the first freeze came. As summer turned to fall, the tone changed. The walls were finished. The roof framing was up. It was no longer a curiosity in progress. It was becoming a place someone might actually live. That's when doubt hardened into certainty. People stopped asking questions and started making predictions. They said the bottles would shatter once temperatures dropped. That moisture trapped inside the walls would freeze and crack everything from the inside out. That glass had no place in a winter house. A man who knew construction insisted the walls would sweat constantly, soaking the interior and rotting whatever touched them. Another claimed the sunlight alone would turn the place into a freezer at night and an oven during the day. Children were less restrained. They threw small stones when no one was looking, waiting for the sharp sound of breaking glass that never came. The stones bounced off the plastered surface and rolled away silently. The walls didn't ring. They didn't flex. They absorbed the impact without complaint. The kids lost interest quickly, disappointed. The man noticed all of it. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't correct the rumors. He understood that explanations rarely mattered once people had decided something couldn't work. The house wasn't meant to convince them anyway. It was meant to last. By late autumn, the first cold nights arrived. Frost-coated fields before sunrise, lingering longer each morning. People used the chill as confirmation of their beliefs. They pointed at the bottle house and shook their heads. Someone said it wouldn't make it through a single winter, that the walls would explode once the real cold arrived. Another joked that it would sound like gunfire when the glass started cracking. The roof went on quietly. It was simple, solid, nothing decorative. Once it was sealed, the house changed immediately. Inside, even on cold mornings, the air felt still, not warm yet, but protected. Wind noise faded to almost nothing. Sound itself behaved differently, softened by the thickness of the walls. It felt less like a structure and more like a container. As winter approached, the laughter grew sharper. The house stood out even more once leaves fell and the landscape emptied. With no distractions, the bottle walls became the only thing people talked about. Some said it was dangerous. Others said it was irresponsible. A few openly waited for it to fail, as if failure would confirm something important to them. The man moved in before the first snow. There was no ceremony, no announcement. Just a few belongings carried inside, a stove set in place, fuel stacked neatly nearby. He sealed the door and went about his routine. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, the house felt finished. The first snowfall came early that year, light and dry, more of a warning than a threat. Snow dusted the roof and gathered against the walls. People watched closely. They listened for cracks that never came. They waited for glass to shatter, for plaster to split, for something dramatic to justify their certainty. Nothing happened. As the snow melted and refroze, the walls remained silent. No leaks, no condensation, no sound of stress. The house stood as it had the day before, unmoved by the attention it received. The laughter didn't stop yet, but it softened. The predictions grew less specific. Instead of saying when it would fail, people began saying eventually. Winter hadn't arrived in full yet. The real cold was still weeks away. But the house had already passed its first test, not against temperature, but against expectation. And for the first time, some of the people watching began to wonder if the walls they had mocked might be stronger than they looked. By the time winter settled in for real, The bottle walls were no longer just an idea people argued about. They were a finished fact, standing quietly while temperatures dropped night after night. What most people never understood was that the house wasn't warm because of glass. It was warm because of everything the glass made possible. Glass, by itself, was never the point. Windows lost heat quickly because air moved across them freely. Wind stripped warmth away, carrying it off faster than any stove could replace it. What he had built was the opposite of that. Each bottle was sealed, its air trapped and motionless. Cold could touch the outside surface, but it couldn't travel easily beyond it. Still air slowed everything down. Thousands of bottles meant thousands of small, sealed air pockets locked inside the walls. Not one large cavity where heat could circulate and escape, but countless tiny ones where nothing moved. Cold pressed in from the outside, but it had to pass through plaster, then glass, then trapped air, then glass again, then more mortar before it could even reach the interior surface. By the time it did, it had lost most of its strength. The thickness of the walls mattered just as much. They weren't thin partitions pretending to be barriers. They were heavy, deep, slow to change. Temperature didn't swing quickly inside them. When the air outside dropped suddenly, the walls absorbed the change gradually, spreading it out over time instead of letting it rush through. That delay was everything. The mortar played its own role. Lime-based, not rigid, it expanded and contracted gently with temperature changes. Where modern cement would crack under stress, this mixture flexed slightly and settled back into place. It sealed without locking itself into a brittle shape. No sharp lines for cold to exploit, no straight paths for cracks to follow. Wind, which defeated so many houses every winter, had nothing to work with here. The walls were solid, continuous, and airtight. There were no hollow cavities for drafts to run through, no seams where air could whistle and steal heat. Inside, the air stayed still. That stillness was what made the space feel warmer than the thermometer suggested. Even moisture behaved differently. People had warned that condensation would soak the walls, that glass would sweat and rot the house from the inside. But moisture needs temperature swings and moving air to become a problem. The bottle walls changed slowly. Warm air didn't rush outward to meet cold surfaces. It lingered, steady, reducing the conditions that caused water to form in the first place. The house was also small on purpose. There was no wasted volume to heat. The ceiling sat lower than most, keeping warmth from rising into useless space. Heat stayed where people lived, not trapped above them. The stove didn't work harder than necessary. It worked efficiently, feeding warmth into a structure designed to keep it. From the outside, the house still looked fragile to those who didn't know better. Glass carried a reputation it couldn't escape. People thought of shattering, of sudden failure, of things breaking all at once. But nothing about the walls was sudden. Every element worked slowly, deliberately, resisting change instead of reacting to it. Inside, the difference was unmistakable. Sound softened. The cold lost its edge. The house didn't feel sealed in an uncomfortable way. It felt protected. The kind of protection that didn't demand attention, the kind that allowed life to continue without constant adjustment. Winter pressed harder as weeks passed. Temperatures dipped well below freezing and stayed there. Snow piled up and lingered. Yet the walls never cracked. No glass shattered. No sudden failures announced themselves in the night. The bottle walls did exactly what they were built to do. They slowed winter down. Most people thought surviving cold meant fighting it. Stronger heat, thicker fuel stacks, constant effort. This house took a different approach. It didn't fight winter. It absorbed it, softened it, and refused to let it rush inside. And while people outside still debated whether it should have worked, inside the bottle house, winter was already losing its grip, not because of luck, but because the walls had been built to make it so. The winter of 1974 did not arrive all at once. It tightened slowly, day by day. the way serious winters always do. The first week brought steady snow that never fully melted. The second week brought cold that stayed overnight instead of lifting with the sun. By the time January settled in, the temperature dropped to 18 degrees and stopped pretending it would rise again. Snow packed the roads into narrow corridors. Fences disappeared. Fields became smooth, white plains with no depth or texture. The wind moved constantly, not violently but persistently, searching for weak points the way it always does. This was the kind of winter that punished small mistakes. A door not sealed properly, a wall too thin, a structure built to look right instead of work right. Other houses began to show signs of strain. Drafts became impossible to ignore. Stoves burned longer and hotter. Fuel piles shrank faster than expected. At night, people listened to their walls creak and pop as materials contracted, wood complaining under stress it wasn't designed to manage. Condensation froze on windows. Ice formed along interior seams where warm air leaked outward and met the cold head-on. Inside the bottle house, the change was quieter. The temperature dropped, yes, but slowly. There were no sudden shocks. No moments where the cold seemed to rush in. The walls absorbed the difference the way they were meant to, taking hours to respond to what the outside air did in minutes. When the stove was lit, the warmth didn't disappear upward or outward. It settled. It stayed. At night, when the cold outside deepened, the house didn't respond with noise, no sharp cracks, no snapping sounds of stressed material. The glass stayed silent. The mortar held. The walls behaved like a single solid mass instead of a collection of fragile parts. The man slept without waking, to check the stove constantly, something few others in the area could say that winter. As January wore on, snowstorms stacked on top of one another. Not dramatic blizzards, but relentless accumulation. Snow stayed where it fell, compacting under its own weight. Drifts hardened into walls. Travel became difficult, then impossible for days at a time. People stayed inside because there was nowhere else to go. In other houses, the cold crept inward inch by inch. Rooms near exterior walls became unusable. Families clustered around heat sources. Breath fogged in hallways. People wore coats indoors and still complained of the chill. The winter demanded attention at all hours. The bottle house required less. The interior temperature never felt impressive, but it felt stable. The kind of warmth that didn't announce itself, but didn't disappear either. The stove burned steadily, not aggressively. Fuel lasted longer than expected. Heat lingered in the walls even after the fire died down, releasing itself slowly instead of vanishing. The most surprising part wasn't warmth, it was silence. Wind passed outside, but it didn't announce itself indoors. There was no whistling through cracks, no subtle movement of cold air that made the space feel unsettled. The stillness inside the walls was complete. The air felt heavy, calm, contained. Winter could be heard elsewhere, in the trees, in the distance, in the way the world sounded muffled under snow, but not inside. People expected glass to fail dramatically. They imagined sharp cracks echoing through the night, bottles shattering one by one under pressure. That never happened. The walls never rang. They never fractured. The bottles were supported evenly, surrounded completely, never taking stress at a single point. Cold pressed from outside, but it had no leverage. Moisture, another predicted problem, never became one. There were no damp patches, no sweating walls, no frozen streaks along the interior surface. The slow temperature changes and sealed air prevented condensation from forming in the first place. What little moisture existed stayed stable, not cycling between states the way it did in thinner buildings. Weeks passed like this, cold without crisis, snow without collapse. The winter tested the house continuously, not with one dramatic moment, but with repetition, night after night, storm after storm. Each time, the bottle walls responded the same way, by not reacting at all. People noticed. They didn't say much at first, but when they visited, stepping inside out of curiosity or necessity, the difference was immediate. Coats stayed on at first, out of habit. Then gloves came off. People stood still, listening, confused by the absence of what they expected to feel. No biting cold, no rushing drafts, just quiet. Someone knocked on the wall once, hard, expecting a hollow sound. It came back dull and solid. Someone else pressed a hand against the surface and left it there longer than necessary, testing. The wall didn't feel cold in the way they were used to. It felt neutral. Outside, the winter continued to drain energy from everything it touched. Inside the bottle house, energy stayed where it was put. Not trapped in a fragile way, but held, slowly released, managed. By late February, the cold finally began to ease. The change was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. Snow softened. Daylight lasted longer. People emerged cautiously, counting losses and repairs. Roofs sagged, walls cracked. Fuel shortages were discussed quietly, as if speaking too openly might invite the cold back. The bottle house stood unchanged. No shattered glass, no hidden damage revealed by thaw, no signs of stress finally giving way. The winter had done everything it could, and the walls had simply endured. What people had expected to fail had been tested for months instead, not in theory, not in debate, but in the only way winter ever tests anything, by surviving it. When the cold finally released its hold, it did so without ceremony. The snow didn't disappear overnight. It softened, settled, and slowly gave back the shape of the land. Rooflines re-emerged, fences rose out of drifts. The winter of 1974 became something people could walk through and point at, measuring what it had taken from them. Damage showed itself everywhere: cracked walls, split beams, repairs postponed until warmer days finally arrived. People spoke about fuel shortages and long nights spent listening to heaters struggle. The winter had not been dramatic, but it had been exhausting. It left behind a quiet understanding that survival had been closer than anyone liked to admit. The bottle house looked the same as it had before the snow fell. Up close, there were no spiderweb cracks in the walls, no loose plaster, no sharp lines where glass had shifted or broken. The surface was intact, firm beneath the hand. When people knocked, the sound was still dull and heavy, unchanged by months of cold. The walls had not aged a season in a single winter. Neighbors came by without invitations. Some brought tools, assuming there must be hidden damage to uncover. Others brought questions. They touched the walls more carefully now, as if expecting the house to prove something else. They traced faint, circular patterns beneath the plaster, where bottles lay locked in place, realizing how much mass had been hidden from view. Conversations changed tone. No one joked anymore. No one spoke with certainty about what should or shouldn't work. Instead, they asked how many bottles it took, what kind of mortar had been used, how thick the walls really were. They wanted details now, not opinions. The man answered simply. He didn't claim to have outsmarted winter. He didn't say the house was perfect. He explained what he had seen and what he had built in response. Still air, thick walls, sealed surfaces, a structure that changed slowly instead of reacting all at once. Some people left unconvinced, but quieter. Others stayed longer, thinking. A few began stacking bottles of their own behind sheds, not copying the house outright, but remembering the lesson it represented. The bottle walls never became common. They weren't easy. They took time, patience, and attention to detail most people didn't want to give. Modern materials were faster. Familiar designs were more comfortable to trust. But the house remained, standing through summers and winters that followed, unchanged by the skepticism that had surrounded it at the beginning. The winter of 1974 became a reference point. Before that winter, after that winter. And always, the bottle house was part of the comparison. It wasn't famous. It didn't attract visitors from far away. It simply existed, quietly reminding people that winter respects preparation more than tradition. Years later, when people spoke about strange buildings that worked, they didn't laugh the way they once had. They spoke carefully, remembering a time when glass walls were supposed to fail and didn't, remembering how assumptions had cracked long before the bottles ever did. The house never tried to prove anything. It didn't need to. Winter had already done that for it. And when the next cold season came, as it always does, the bottle walls waited, unchanged, patient and ready, built not to impress anyone, but to endure exactly what winter would bring again.